Hello there and welcome to this Biology Mind A-Level tutorial on monosaccharides. So in the last lesson we learned that a monosaccharide is an example of a monomer and that monosaccharides can be used to make polymers called carbohydrates. And remember, how are these bonds formed to make a polymer? They're formed by condensation reactions. So this is what we covered in our last lesson. So today we want to think about two key learning objectives. Number one, simple sugars and monosaccharides, and number two, glucose and its isomers. So let's think about simple and complex sugars first of all. So simple sugars include monosaccharides and disaccharides. Now, mono means one, and di means two, and poly means many. So that's a really nice way of remembering what monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides are. Because this over here is a monosaccharide, so a single unit, or a monomer. This over here is a disaccharide, and this over here is a polysaccharide. So remember one, two, many. And examples of monosaccharides include glucose and fructose, and also, if I just go on to the next slide, also galactose. So these are examples of our monomers. Examples of our disaccharides are our lactose and maltose. So together, monosaccharides and disaccharides are referred to as our simple sugars. Now, complex sugars include things like starch and cellulose, which we'll think about near the end of our tutorial. So simple sugars can be joined to make polymers, which we call complex carbohydrates. So let's think about what monosaccharides actually are. So they're formed from these three basic elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nothing else. This is our general formula for our monosaccharide. It is carbon, H2O. So all this means is that for however many carbon and oxygen we have in our formula, we're always going to have double the number of hydrogen atoms in there. Now we'll go on to have a look at an example of this on a later slide, but just keep in mind that this is our general formula for monosaccharides. So glucose is involved in respiration, which releases energy in living organisms. And remember, glucose is an example of a monosaccharide. So remember what respiration is. We're combining glucose and oxygen to give carbon dioxide plus water plus ATP. So it's a really, really important source of energy for cells in living organisms. So glucose, a monosaccharide, forms a pivotal role in living organisms. Now, glucose is a hexose sugar. So hex means 6. Now, why have we got this 6 stem? So that's referring to the number of carbons in this structure. And you can see that there are 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And if we think about going back to our basic formula for monosaccharides, we know that our basic formula is this. So let's have a think about what this actually means. So we know there are 6 carbons. So that means that there's also 6. That means that N equals 6, first of all, let's say. So that means that there's also 6 oxygens, which means that there's 6 times 2 hydrogens. So there's 12 hydrogens. So let's see whether that's right. So we know we've got our 6 carbons. So now let's count up our oxygen. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then let's think about our hydrogens. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So the formula for our monosaccharide here, our glucose, is C6H12O6. And that's glucose, and you can see that I got that just from knowing the number of carbon atoms, knowing that it's a hexose sugar, and applying it to this basic formula for a monosaccharide. So that's glucose. Interestingly, glucose has 2 isomers. Now, have a go at having a think which isomer each one of these is. I'll give you a clue. One is called alpha glucose and one is called beta glucose, so try and match it up. You're going to be 50-50 right or wrong. Okay, we'll reveal the answers now. So this is alpha glucose and this is beta glucose. Now remember, isomers have the same chemical formula, so they are both C6H12O6, C6H12O6. So they have the same chemical formula, but a different arrangement of atoms in space. That's the definition of isomers. And rightly so, between alpha glucose and beta glucose, they just have a different arrangement of this in space. So in alpha glucose, the hydroxyl group is facing downwards here, and in beta glucose, the hydroxyl group is facing upwards here. Now you might think, well, how much does that really matter? Can't they just rotate and they're basically the same thing? After all, they have the same formula. Well, no, remember that we've got these lovely bonds here. Carbon forms 4 bonds, remember? And that holds it in this structure. So it can't change out of the structure. So you have to commit to memory that alpha glucose has this hydroxyl group on the bottom here and beta glucose has this hydroxyl group on the top here. Now, the reason that this is important actually, before I move on to the next slide, is because, remember, glucose is a monosaccharide and many monosaccharides join together to form different structures. So if you have 2 different isomers of a monosaccharide, they can each form their own structures. So alpha glucose as a monosaccharide forms the polysaccharide amylose, whereas beta glucose as a monosaccharide forms the polysaccharide cellulose, as an example. Okay, and these are just further examples of more biologically relevant sugars. So I'm sure this rings a bell. So this is ribose. Let's have a look at how many carbon atoms it's got. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's plug that into that equation that we had. It was CH2O N. So we know N equals 5. Therefore, the formula of ribose is C5H10O5. And that is our ribose. And we know that ribose is a really important sugar that's incorporated into ribonucleic acid, or RNA, which we know is really, really important in cellular dynamics. So, it's really important. We've covered the structures of alpha glucose and beta glucose, but you should also spend some time learning the names and structures of some other common and biologically relevant sugars. Well done for completing today's tutorial, and I will see you for the next tutorial.